Hello, today we're removing the water pump for replacement from a Buick 3.8 liter V6 engine, also known as the 3800. The first thing we're going to do is to remove the engine coolant overflow tank. First take the cap off, then this piece which holds it to the washer fluid tank. Grip the base and pull straight up. It should separate in this track. Set it somewhere off to the side, leaving the coolant return hose attached. Now we're going to look for the water pump. It's central to the engine, right above the harmonic balancer for the crank. It'll be right about here on most engines. There will be 4 bolts that hold it in place. You're going to want to leave the serpentine belt on the engine for this step, since it provides tension to keep the pulley in place while we're turning the bolts. There are 4 bolts on the side of the pulley, keeping it attached to the water pump. They are about size 10mm. You can use any kind of socket you like. Just barely loosen the bolts so that they'll turn easily with the ratchet. After they're loose, now we can remove the serpentine belt. This process is relatively simple, but you might need some help. You're going to need a size 19mm socket. Apply it to the side of the idler pulley. This is also called the tensioner. Pull straight up. This will release tension on the serpentine belt. Lift the serpentine belt off the alternator and allow it to fall. Carefully release tension on the idler pulley. Now you can safely remove your serpentine belt. It threads all through the engine on each of these pulleys. Be sure you remember the order that it came off in. But if you don't, there's usually instructions right above the radiator that show you how to route the accessory belt. So, now that we have our serpentine belt removed, you can very carefully unthread it here. You can see I've already unbolted the pulley from the water pump. Should come straight out like this. What's on the side of the water pump here are 3/8. Down here, there are 1/2. There are approximately 4 1/2 inch bolts and 6 3/8 inch bolts. So I'll remove those. Something that might be good to do is to drain your coolant. Since you're changing the water pump, it's probably some other condition that caused the pump to fail. So here's what it looks like with all the bolts removed. And as you can see, some of the coolant will run out the bolt holes. This is normal. Be sure you have something to catch underneath. Either that or just rinse it away so that animals don't get into it. Here's the bolts that I have on my particular water pump. There are 4 of the smaller 3/8 inch bolts and 4 of the larger 1/2 inch bolts. This is what the side of the engine will look like once you have the water pump removed. Most likely some chunks of the gasket material will remain on the block of the engine. You can remove this using a putty knife. They're available at most hardware. So here's our high temp RTV silicone gasket maker. We're going to put this between the gasket and the water pump itself. That'll help to hold it in place so that while we're installing it, it won't slip. With most of these, you're going to need to cut the end off of the nipple. You need to cut it so that there's a hole that's large enough so that the silicone flows easily, but small enough so that you have control over where it goes on the surface. You want a very thin coat since we're not actually using this to make the gasket, but rather to hold the real gasket in place. You want to make sure it's even and that you don't miss any spots. So I'm just putting the finishing touches here. You should have a nice even coat across the entire surface of the water pump. The gasket won't cover the entire surface, but you want to be sure that you have it there just in case. So just line your gasket up and press it into place. You have to find a nice flat surface so that you can set this water pump with the gasket side down so that it seals nice and level. You don't want it curling up or separating anywhere. So now I have my bolts in position on the water pump. I've also placed some gasket sealer on the back of my gasket. I'm going to line up the bolt holes on the block and very carefully push the water pump into position and tighten up the bolts. I have the water pump in position. I have my bolts that are just finger threaded in there. And tighten them up a little more and then start putting the 3/8 inch bolts back in. For some of these bolts you may wish to have an extension if you don't have a flexible ratchet like I have. Might make access to these bolts a little easier. I'm going to install the pulley here. Just look for which holes are threaded. On this particular water pump, there's knobs out the backs on the holes that aren't threaded. So place it like this. I'm going to grab the bolts for it. Insert it through the hole and turn it a little bit until I find the matching threaded hole on the water pump. I'm not tightening these all the way yet, because I don't have anything to hold it in place. I'll do that after I reinstall the serpentine belt. Okay, so now to put the serpentine belt back on. You can usually look on the top of the radiator cover here, and you'll see a table that says accessory belt routing. Here's what it looks like. I'll zoom in a bit here just so you can see a little more detail. So there it is. Oops. So where it's labeled WP right here, that's a water pump. This is the pulley on the crank. That's for the air conditioner if you have one. This is power steering. And what's this? This is the idler, and that's your alternator. Belt from the crank pulley down there up around the power steering on the left side over here. Then down below to the idler pulley. Might need a little bit of slack to get it in between the two. Like this. Then this belt on the right comes up behind the water pump like this and back down around to the air conditioner. And this pulley goes up, this part of the belt goes up and over the alternator like so. And it would go around the air conditioning compressor down there. Since we aren't going to have enough belt to do both the alternator and the air conditioning compressor at the same time, you're going to want to choose the one that's closer and easier to work with when we have to release the tension on the belt. So I'm going to take it off the alternator for now, run the belt around the air conditioning compressor, like so, and hold it like this. Now I'll need to get my ratchet that I used earlier, put it on the bolt for the tensioner, and pull it to my left. This should give me enough slack to put it over the alternator and line it up on the shiny spot on that pulley for the water pump. There.